Hello, and welcome to a new installment of LNE North America webinars. My name is Julian Senak, and I am a Certification Project Manager and IVD Technical File and Design Dossier Assessor at LNE North America. Today, we will discuss the potential regulatory changes of the upcoming European regulation on in vitro diagnostic devices with a focus on performance evidence and performance studies requirements. In this webinar, we will start with an overview of the process of development of a new European IVD regulation and discuss where we are now and what will be the next step until implementation of the regulation. We will review some of the important changes introduced by the new regulation and dig into our topic of interest with some key concepts. We will then review the performance evaluation and performance studies requirements presented on the last available draft of the regulation. And we will finish the presentation with performance follow-up to be performed as part of the post-market surveillance. So let's start with the overview of the process used to develop the new regulation and where we are now. In September 2012, the European Commission proposed a revision to regulatory requirements for in vitro diagnostic devices with the draft of a new European regulation to replace Directive 98/79/EC. The draft was submitted to the European Parliament and the European Council, which in turn provided draft with their own revision in October 2013 and September 2015 respectively. The three documents added to the trilogue phase in October 2015 to reach a consensus among the three drafts. The trilogue is conducted between representatives of each institution, the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. So where are we now? A few weeks ago, the Council presidency, held by the Netherlands, and representatives of the Parliament have announced that a political agreement has been reached and a final draft will be proposed to the Parliament and the Council for a final vote. So what's next? Upon endorsement of the political agreement and presentation of the final draft of the IVD regulation, this regulation will be reviewed and translated in all languages of the European Union and distributed to all members of the Parliament and of the European Council. The text will be submitted to a vote by members of the Parliament and members of the European Council, and if the regulation is adopted, it will be published on the official Journal of the European Union. The rule of the new regulation will fully apply 5 years after this publication. Please keep in mind that the process is not finished yet and that the text is not final until its adoption and publication, so things can change. As we are recording this webinar, the draft resulting from the political agreement have been released and all information presented here are based on this draft. First, let's review some of the highlights of the regulation so far. This will help us to better understand what will be needed to answer the requirements we will present later. One of the changes of the new regulation is change in the classification system. While the actual system is list-based and product-specific for self-testing devices, the new system will use a risk-based approach classification. Without going too much into details in the future rules of classification, there will be 4 new classes from A to D. A representing the lower risk to individual and public health, for example, specimen receptacle, and D the highest for individual and public health, for example, HIV test. With this new classification and based on the draft of the political agreement, self-testing devices will be Class C, except for devices used for the detection of pregnancy, for fertility testing, and for determining cholesterol level, and devices for the detection of glucose, erythrocyte, leukocytes, and bacteria in urine, which will be Class B. It is very important for the manufacturer to properly identify the class of their device, as the level of requirement will be proportionate to the risk level of the device. So let's switch gear and focus on today's topic. One aspect of the new regulation is the emphasis on clinical evidence in performance evaluation, and compared to the current directive, the new regulation makes the need of clinical evidence and performance evaluation more explicit and prescriptive. Clinical data and performance evaluation, which constitute clinical evidence, should support the intended purpose of the device and are required to demonstrate compliance to essential requirements on safety and performance of the devices. The new regulation will also introduce documentary requirements. The manufacturer will be required to establish a plan, define procedures to execute this performance evaluation. Moreover, the manufacturer is required to analyze the results obtained from this evaluation and document them in a performance evaluation report. The performance evaluation plan and report will have to be included in the technical documentation of the device. So, the manufacturer should establish a performance evaluation plan and procedures to demonstrate scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance of the device to fulfill safety and performance requirements. This means that the manufacturer really need to make sure that there is no holes in their clinical evidence or logic when performing their clinical evaluation. As mentioned before, the new regulation is more descriptive and prescriptive, and in Annex 12, the regulation provides the list of elements to be included in the performance evaluation plan. If the manufacturer does not include a required item, it will have to provide a justification for not including it instead. It is important for the manufacturer to keep in mind that all devices, no matter the class, should have a performance evaluation, which means to have a performance evaluation plan, a procedures, and a report. The difference between devices will be in the components of this evaluation. For example, a less complex or risky device may have less components to the clinical evaluation. So, how to evaluate the scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance of a device? For this, also, the regulation provides a general methodology based on 3 steps. The first step will be to identify through systematic scientific literature review the available data relevant to the device and its intended purpose, and identify any remaining unaddressed gap or issues in the data. The second step would be to appraise available data by evaluating their suitability for establishing the safety and performance of the device. And finally, to generate any new or additional data needed to address outstanding issues. More than general principle, the regulation get even more prescriptive for each demonstration and give sources that should be used to demonstrate performances. According to the regulation, the scientific validity can be demonstrated by relevant information on the scientific validity of the devices measuring the same analyte or marker, by scientific or peer-reviewed literature, by consensus expert opinion or position from relevant professional association, by results from proof of concept studies, by results from clinical performance studies. In all cases, the scientific validity of the analyte or the marker should be demonstrated and documented in the scientific validity report. The demonstration of the analytical performance should in general be demonstrated on the basis of analytical performance studies and analyzed and documented in the analytical performance report. For novel marker, demonstration could be achieved by comparison with other method or clinical performance studies to compare performance with current clinical standard practice. Finally, the demonstration of the clinical performance of a device should be based on one or more of the following sources: the clinical performance studies, the scientific peer-reviewed literature, or published experience gained by routine diagnostic testing. Moreover, the regulation mentioned that clinical performance studies shall be performed unless it is duly justified to rely on other sources of clinical performance data. And as for scientific validity and analytical performance, the clinical performance should be demonstrated and documented in the clinical performance report. Upon completion and demonstration of scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance of the device, the manufacturer will have to prepare a performance evaluation report. The objective of the report will be to document the clinical evidence, which, as mentioned before, should support the intended purpose of the device and demonstrate compliance to essential requirements on safety and performance of the device. The demonstration of clinical evidence would be achieved in the performance evaluation report by assessment of the scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance reports. The key point of this report will be to create the link between the data and the conclusion about the conformity of the device. What we have observed in the past is that most people either present the data without making a conclusion or present the data as a conclusion. Here the data, therefore the device is safe, for example. Tomorrow the manufacturer will have to tell us why the data is important and interpret it in the light of the requirement and standards. Lastly, for Class C and D devices, the performance report will have to be updated at least annually. As the regulation emphasizes on clinical evidence and performance evaluation, the regulation have clear reference to the need of clinical performance studies. So we will now look at the requirement that will be introduced by the regulation on clinical performance studies. Clinical performance studies as presented in the regulation could be considered the equivalent of clinical trials. And like for the clinical trials, the key point of this requirement is to protect performance study subject over all other considerations. Article 48 to 57 and Annex 12 Part 2 provide an exhaustive list of requirements surrounding the design, authorization, and performance of clinical performance studies. For interventional studies and studies involving risk to the subject, more requirements are provided in Annex 13. These requirements are highly similar to requirements of the regulation on clinical trial for medicinal product, Regulation 536-2014. In the interest of time in this webinar, we will cover general requirements associated with these studies. All clinical performance studies will have to be designed to maximize the relevance of the data while minimizing the potential bias. In order to do so, clinical performance studies will have to be performed on the basis of a plan. This plan will define the rationale, the objective, methodology, proposed analysis, monitoring, conduct and record keeping of the clinical performance study. The Annex 12 of the new regulation presents the extent of information that will be required in the plan. Among other information, this plan will have to include investigator and investigation sites information, the design identification and justification of such a design. The sponsor will also have to include a description of the informed consent process, with copy of the subject information and consent forms. The requirement on the content of informed consent is also presented in the regulation, with specificity depending on the type of subject, such as pregnant women, minors, incapacitated subject, and others. These data would have to be protected, and method used for the protection of them would have to be provided in the plan. Criteria and procedures for suspension or early termination of the study would have to be included in the plan, as well as criteria and procedures for the follow-up of subject after completion of the study. To conduct a clinical performance study, the sponsor would have to ensure that the performance study is conducted in accordance with the approved performance study plan. The sponsor would have to monitor the conduct of the performance study to verify that the rights, safety, and well-being of subjects are protected, that the reported data are reliable and robust, and that the conduct of the performance study is in compliance with the requirement of the regulation. The sponsor will have to record, process, and store all performance study data, which includes subject data and related protection of this data. Lastly, the sponsor will have to establish procedures for emergency situation to enable the immediate identification and, if necessary, an immediate recall of the devices used in the study. Upon completion of the performance study, a clinical performance study report signed by a medical practitioner or any other authorized person responsible will have to be prepared. This report should contain the study protocol plan, the results, and conclusion of the clinical study, including all negative results as well as any modification to the protocol or deviation and data exclusion. This last variable will have to be duly justified. Other requirements are also introduced by the new regulations, such as the obligation for sponsors established outside the Union to have a legal representative established in the Union to submit an application for a clinical performance study. The legal representative will be responsible to ensure compliance of the study with this regulation and to be the addressee of all communications. With the new regulation, application for a clinical study will be submitted electronically and only once, even if the study is performed in more than one member state. All performance studies shall be subject to a scientific and ethical review. The ethical review shall be performed by an ethics committee in accordance with the law of the member state concerned by the study, and at least one layperson should participate in the ethical review. The last point we would like to touch on this webinar are requirements related to post-market performance follow-up. The post-market performance follow-up is part of the post-market surveillance program, which will be discussed in a different webinar. But it is also closely linked to the performance evaluation of the device to assess safety and performance. The post-market performance follow-up, also called PMPF, is a continuous process to update the performance evaluation, and like for the performance evaluation, this process will require the manufacturer to establish a plan and to proactively collect and evaluate safety, performance, and scientific data. The plan shall include the objective of the performance follow-up, but also the general and specific method and procedures to gather performance and scientific data. These includes feedback from customer, screening of scientific literature, but also epidemiological studies, post-market performance studies. The rationale to use this method should be provided in the plan. Moreover, the plan should also include the evaluation of the state-of-the-art and performance data gathered from equivalent devices. Upon execution of the PMPF plan, the manufacturer will have to analyze the collected data and draw a conclusion on the safety and performance of the device. This conclusion will then be an input to the performance evaluation report of the device. In the case of a PMPF is not deemed appropriate for the device, then the manufacturer shall justify and document it in the performance evaluation report. To finish this presentation, we will also cover some case study. So the first case is a company called Awesome IVD that planned to place on the market a new product to diagnose syphilis infection. Two competitors have similar products already CE marked. So based on the classification we discussed earlier, this element is a Class C device. Today, in 2016, based on the state of the art, you have to provide the analytical sensitivity, diagnostic sensitivity, analytical and diagnostic specificity, accuracy, repeatability, limit of detection, non-interference, etc. Tomorrow, when the new regulation will be in place, you will have to demonstrate the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and as you can see, some of the elements are already required now, so it might still just need to be performed or put in a report or analyze the data already collected. And you also have to provide a clinical performance. And this also will be data that might have been collected before. Now, how do you collect this data? Today, you collect the data that originate from studies of the clinical or other appropriate environment or results of biographical references. Tomorrow, you would have to perform an evaluation, provide a plan, analyze the data through a procedure, and provide a report. Now, because this device is a Class C, this report will have to be updated as necessary, so when you have a modification, for example, but at least it would have to be updated annually. Our second case is a company called Are You Pregnant, who have a CE marked pregnancy self-test product on the market already. Their classification here is a Class B. The elements you have to provide today are based on the state of the art, but also on the skills and means available to users, as this is a self-testing device. And as for the other one, the list of elements to provide is fairly similar. Tomorrow you would have to demonstrate, once again, the scientific validity. So this means the markers and analytes that you use, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance. How will you collect this data? And again, this is the same. Today you use studies in clinics, you have other performance evaluation or biographical information. Now you will have to perform an evaluation study, and this will include a plan, the procedures to obtain the data and analyze them, and a report. However, contrary to the case 1, you don't have the requirements of an annual update. You have to just update as necessary. To conclude this webinar, we want to give you the take-home message today. The clinical evidence today should demonstrate scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. The clinical data will have to be collected following a plan and procedures, and it will have to be collected over the entire lifetime of the device. One more take-home message, which is very important, is to keep in mind that this is not the last version of the regulation, and that until the vote and publication in the official journal of the European Union, this regulation can change. Thank you for listening to this webinar. I hope this was helpful, and if you have any question, please feel free to contact us by email at contact@lne-america.com. Thank you.